What if I told you that the greatest battle of the Vikings did not take place in England or France? It was not a battle of swords and shields, but a silent annual war against an enemy that could not be defeated. Absolute cold and darkness. When the fjords were frozen over and the sun barely rose above the horizon, the real test of survival began. Their longhouses were buried in snow, and their precious food supplies began to dwindle with each passing day. The true genius of this people was not manifested in the fury of a berserker, but in the quiet calculation of a storekeeper. It was what was stored in the cellars and smokehouses that determined whether the clan would see the first green shoots of spring. Survival was a technology based on smoke, ice, salt, and time itself. They learned to preserve life itself, locking it in barrels and drying it in the icy wind. Watch the video to the end to find out what hidden preservation techniques allowed them to survive the dark months and why their true genius lay not in raids, but in what was stored in their pantries. I will reveal the Vikings' best-kept secret, and it has nothing to do with weapons. This secret is the architecture of their storage facilities, a true engineering masterpiece created to combat their main enemy, hunger. Survival did not begin with food, but with a place to store it. The longhouse was not just a dwelling, but also the first line of defense in this battle. The center of the system was a cellar or underground chamber, dug directly under the hearth or in the coolest part of the house. This space, called a zvalg, used the constant temperature of the earth to protect supplies. Here in the darkness and coolness, the most fragile foods were stored, protected from frost and rot. Clay pots and wooden barrels stood in rows, holding the clan's most precious treasures. Above people's heads, under the roof itself, was another important space, the attic. It was constantly filled with warm smoke from the central hearth, which had no chimney and vented through special openings. This smoke was not a nuisance, it was technology. Meat and fish were hung here for slow smoking, turning fresh produce into long-lasting supplies. Outside the house, separate barns known as stabber were often built. These structures were the pinnacle of engineering. They were built on high wooden or stone piles to protect precious grain from moisture coming from the ground. The pile construction also served as a barrier, making it difficult to access the supplies.
The snows will be heavy this year. We must ensure the grain holds.
Every element of the storage facility was carefully thought out. Slits in the walls of the barns ensured constant circulation of dry air, preventing the growth of mold. The doors were low and sturdy, and the locks, although primitive, served as a symbol of the value of the contents. This entire system was designed for one purpose: to defeat time. Managing these supplies was a complex logistical task. There was a strict hierarchy of what was eaten first and what was stored until deep winter. The first to go were foods that could spoil quickly, while dried and fermented foods remained untouched until the darkest months. It was this infrastructure that was the basis of the Vikings' power. It allowed them not only to survive the winter, but also to accumulate surpluses. These surpluses freed up time and resources for building ships, creating weapons, and ultimately for the very expeditions that changed the history of Europe. We would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about how such a simple but ingenious storage system determined their entire way of life? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about what actually made up 90% of a Viking's diet? Despite images of warriors feasting on huge chunks of meat, the reality was much more prosaic. The basis of their survival, their daily bread, in the truest sense of the word, was grain. Without it, there would have been no strength for expeditions, nor life itself. The main crop was barley, known as big. It was incredibly hardy and could grow in the harsh northern climate, on poor, rocky soils. Barley was versatile. It was used to make bread, porridge, and, just as importantly, ale. It was the main source of calories during the winter months.
He looked like a drowned rat trying to sim home.
By Odin's beard, that's a fine tale. To the ale.
In addition to barley, rye or rug, and oats, hafrar were also grown. Rye produced a darker and denser bread that did not go stale for a long time. Oats were most often used to make a hearty porridge that warmed the body on long, cold mornings. Every grain counted. The daily work of turning this grain into food was monotonous but vital. Women spent hours turning heavy hand mills, kvernstein, grinding dried grain into flour. This sound was a constant background to life in the longhouse, a symbol that life goes on. The most common dish was grauter, a thick and filling porridge. It was cooked in water or, if they were lucky, in milk. It was a simple but hot and calorie-rich food. To add variety to the taste, whatever was available was added to the porridge. Dried berries, a little honey, or a piece of butter.
This grauter is good tonight.
Viking bread bore little resemblance to today's fluffy loaves. Most often it was flat, unleavened cakes baked on hot stones or in a pan over a fire. This bread was dense and a little tough, but it was very filling and could be stored for several days. Grain was not just food, it was currency and a measure of wealth. A farmer whose barns were full of barley was considered a successful man. He could feed his family and workers and exchange the surplus for other necessary goods, such as iron or salt. Storing grain was a science in itself. It had to be carefully dried after harvesting so that it would not become damp and moldy. This was the purpose of special barns on stilts, where the wind could circulate freely between the sacks. What simple food do you think was most important for survival in the past? But grain was only a source of calories. In the next chapter, I will reveal the secret of white gold, which was valued no less than silver and stored for years. What if I told you that the Vikings created a product that we would today call a superfood, and that it was the key to their endurance? I'm not talking about meat or fish, but dairy products, which were a crucial part of their diet. In a world where fresh milk would spoil in a day, they developed ingenious ways to preserve it. The main one was skyr. It's not quite yogurt as many people think, but more like a soft, fresh cheese. It was made by slowly fermenting milk and then separating the whey. The result was an incredibly concentrated, protein-rich product. Skyr was the perfect food. It could be stored for weeks in a cool cellar, providing the family with high-quality protein when fresh meat was unavailable. It was eaten on its own, mixed with berries, or diluted with water to make a nutritious drink. The whey left over after making skyr was not wasted either. It was drunk as a refreshing beverage or used as a preservative. It could be poured over meat or other foods, as its acidity slowed the growth of bacteria. It was a waste-free production process. But the real star of the dairy world was butter. The Vikings were obsessed with butter. In the summer, when the grass was lush, cows produced rich milk, and all the surplus was immediately churned into butter. It was a calorie concentrate, pure energy necessary for survival in the cold.
Eat hearty. There is much work ahead in the cold.
The butter had to be preserved for the long winter. To do this, it was either heavily salted, if salt was available, or an even more surprising method was used. They packed the butter into wooden barrels or wrapped it in bark and hid it in peat bogs. It was a brilliant move. The cold, oxygen-free, and acidic environment of the peat bog acted as the perfect natural preservative. The oil could be stored there for years, even decades. It acquired a specific, pungent taste, but remained edible. If you like how we reveal the hidden sides of history, please like this video. Guess what product the Vikings produced on an industrial scale that was as hard as a board, but valued like gold? The answer is turfisk, or what we know today as stockfish. It was dried cod, and it was not just food, but the basis of the economy, trade, and long voyages.
Ah, the turfisk is perfect tonight.
To the sea and the harvest.
Skål!
Northern Norway, especially the Lofoten Islands, was the center of this industry. Every winter, from January to April, huge schools of Arctic cod approached the islands. It was a true natural wonder, and the Vikings learned to take full advantage of it. The production technology was ingenious in its simplicity and required nothing but nature itself. The fish were gutted and tied in pairs by their tails. They were then hung on huge wooden structures resembling frames called yell. The secret ingredient was the cold, dry, and clean winter air. The frost instantly froze the fish, and the constant wind slowly drew all the moisture out of it. At the same time, the fish did not rot, as bacteria could not develop in such cold temperatures. Salt was not needed. After 3 to 4 months, by spring, the fish turned into what the Norwegians called a protein board. It lost up to 80% of its weight, becoming incredibly light and hard as wood. It could literally be used as a club. In this dried form, the fish was practically eternal. It could be stored for 3, 5, or even 10 years without losing its nutritional properties. It was the ideal canned product, light, compact, and incredibly rich in protein. Before consumption, such fish had to be revived. It was soaked in water for several days and then beaten with special hammers to soften the fibers. After that, it could be boiled, stewed, or eaten with butter and flatbread.
Eat well, this will keep the cold away.
This product became the driving force of the Viking era. It was stockfish that they took with them on long voyages to Greenland or North America. It did not spoil in the damp sea air and gave the crew the strength they needed. It was more caloric and lighter than grain. What modern survival product do you think can be compared to this? But drying was not the only method. In the next chapter, you will learn how the Vikings used smoke and salt to preserve meat. Although fish and grain were the staples, a Viking's diet would have been incomplete without meat. Domestic animals were an important part of the economy. Autumn was the time for mass slaughter of livestock. It was a difficult but necessary decision. It was impossible to keep the entire herd during the winter, as there would not be enough hay. Fresh meat was eaten immediately, with feasts held to celebrate the harvest. But the vast majority of carcasses were intended for long-term storage. This is where two main techniques came into play: smoking and salting. They were the key to preserving precious protein. Smoking was one of the oldest and most reliable methods. Pieces of meat were hung high under the roof of a long house. Smoke from the central hearth slowly rose and enveloped the meat. This process could last for weeks or even months. The smoke worked in several ways at once. First, it slowly dried the meat, removing moisture. Second, the chemicals in the smoke had preservative properties, inhibiting the growth of bacteria. Third, it protected the meat from insects. The result was a firm, dark, and very aromatic product. Such smoked meat could hang under the roof all winter, and pieces were cut off as needed. It was added to soups or eaten in thin slices with bread. Another popular method was wind drying, especially for lamb. In Norway, there is still a dish called scarpe, which dates back to the Viking era. It is a dried sheep's ham, dried in the cold mountain wind until it is almost completely dehydrated. The second, and even more reliable method, was salting. The problem was that salt itself was an incredibly expensive and scarce commodity. It was called white gold. It had to be either imported from the south or evaporated from seawater, which was a very laborious process. Where salt was available, it worked wonders. The meat was cut and tightly packed into wooden barrels, with each layer sprinkled with a large amount of salt. The salt drew all the moisture out of the meat, creating an environment in which nothing alive could grow. Such salted meat could be stored almost indefinitely. Barrels of salted meat were a strategic reserve. Before consumption, the meat had to be soaked in several changes of water to remove excess salt. But this was a small price to pay for the preservation of the product. The skillful combination of these methods, smoking, drying, and salting, allowed the Vikings to create a stable supply of meat for the entire long winter. This required enormous effort and foresight, but it guaranteed that there would be plenty of food in the house even in the most severe frosts. What I am about to show you may seem shocking, but it was a brilliant scientific breakthrough. What do you do if you don't have salt and the weather is too wet for drying? The Vikings found the answer, and it lay in a field that we would today call biochemistry. They mastered the art of fermentation. Fermentation is essentially a controlled process of decomposition. The Vikings discovered empirically that if the right conditions were created, certain bacteria could be used to preserve food without allowing harmful bacteria to develop. It was a risky but effective strategy. The most famous and extreme example is hearty, fermented Greenland shark. The meat of this shark is toxic when fresh due to its high urea content. To make it edible, the Vikings developed a complex process that took several months. The shark carcass was first buried in gravel for several weeks or months. The pressure and environment allowed the toxic fluids to escape. The saturated meat was then removed, cut into strips, and hung to dry in the open air for several more months. The result was a product with a very pungent, distinctive smell, but one that was completely safe and nutritious. It was a way to turn an inedible resource into a valuable source of protein in the harsh conditions of Greenland and Iceland. It was a triumph of engineering over nature.
This is the taste of survival. Hearty, fermented and firm. It keeps us strong through the winter.
Another example was rackfisk, fermented trout. The fish was gutted, lightly salted, much less salt was needed than for regular salting, and tightly packed into barrels. It was then left to ferment in its own juice for several months at a low temperature. The fermentation process softened the bones and turned the meat into a paste-like mass with a strong aroma. This method was widespread in the mountainous regions of Norway, where access to the sea was limited and salt was in short supply. The roots of the famous Swedish surströmming, or fermented herring, also go back to this era. The principle is the same. The fish was salted just enough so that it would not rot, but ferment. The barrels in which it fermented swelled over time from the gases.
Ah, the herring is perfect this year.
Which of these methods do you find most inventive? But not all food was so complicated. In the next chapter, we will descend into underground storage rooms for the last gifts of summer. A Viking cellar was not only a storage place for grain and dairy products, it was a veritable underground garden where the last gifts of autumn, vegetables, waited for their moment. Without these modest but reliable sources of nutrition, the diet would have been dangerous and monotonous. The main heroes of the vegetable front were root vegetables. Rutabagas, turnips, and wild varieties of carrots were the main crops. They were valued for their ability to be stored for a long time in a cool, dark place without losing their qualities. They were firm and durable. The root vegetable harvest was the final chord of the agricultural year. They were dug up as late as possible, but before the first serious frosts. Then they were carefully cleaned of soil, but not washed so as not to damage the protective skin. They were stored in the coolest and darkest corners of the cellar. Boxes with dry sand or moss were often used for this purpose. The vegetables were laid out in layers so that they did not touch each other. The sand and moss helped to maintain constant humidity and prevented wilting. In this state, turnips and rutabagas could be stored until spring. They were the basis for winter soups and stews known as scouse. They were cooked for hours with a piece of smoked meat or salted fish to make a thick and hearty dish. Another indispensable vegetable was cabbage. The Vikings grew the ancestors of modern cabbage. It also stored well in cool cellars, but they had another more advanced method of preserving it. They learned to ferment it. The cabbage was finely chopped, mixed with salt, if available, and tightly packed into barrels. Under pressure, it released juice and the process of lactic acid fermentation began. This was, in essence, the Scandinavian equivalent of the famous sauerkraut.
Careful now, it is very hot.
It smells delicious.
Even in the harshest times, the Vikings did not rely solely on what they grew. The forests and swamps surrounding their settlements were not just wilderness, but an additional source of food. Every summer and autumn turned into a large-scale operation to gather wild gifts. Nuts were one of the most valuable resources. Forest nuts, or hazelnuts, grew in abundance. They were gathered in huge quantities. It was the perfect winter food. In their shells, they could be stored for years without losing their nutritional properties.
Make sure these barrels are full. The winter will be long.
We have gathered more than enough this year.
Nuts were a concentrated source of fat and protein. They were eaten as they were, ground into a paste, or added to baked goods and porridge. A handful of nuts could give a person energy for several hours of hard work in the cold. They were a strategic source of calories. Berries were another important gift of the forest. Lingonberries, cranberries, cloudberries, and wild raspberries were all gathered with great zeal. Berries were a source of sugar and vitamins, which were so lacking in the winter diet. Preserving berries was more difficult than nuts. The easiest way was to dry them in the sun or in an oven. Dried berries were then added to porridge and soups, giving them the taste and aroma of summer. A more advanced method was water preservation. Thanks to their natural acids, lingonberries and cranberries could simply be covered with clean cold water in a barrel and stored in the cellar. They remained fresh and firm throughout the winter. If honey, the most valuable sweetener, was available, the berries could be boiled in it. Such jam was not an everyday food, but a real treat that was brought out on special occasions. Herbs and edible plants also played a role. Wild cumin, angelica, nettles, wild garlic. All of these were collected and dried. They served not only as seasonings that enlivened the bland taste of winter food, but also as medicines. In a longhouse, cups were rarely empty, but what sloshed around in them was not just for entertainment. Beverages were as important a part of the diet as bread or meat. In a world where the quality of drinking water was highly questionable, the safest drink was one that had undergone fermentation. The main everyday drink was ale, or earl. It was not the strong drink we know today, but rather a low-alcohol, cloudy, and very nutritious ale that we would call liquid bread. It was brewed from barley, sometimes with the addition of oats.
Drink well, friends. May this keep the cold away.
Skull.
The brewing process was an important part of household management. The grain was germinated to produce malt, then dried, crushed, and boiled to make wort. The addition of hops was not yet common practice, so other herbs, such as yarrow or wormwood, were often used for flavor and preservation. The resulting drink was high in calories and thirst quenching. The process of boiling the wort killed most bacteria, making ale much safer than water from a well or river. It was drunk by everyone, young and old, throughout the day. Ale was not just a drink, it was liquid food. On cold winter days, a mug of warm, thick ale warmed and gave strength. It was an integral part of the meal, complementing simple food made from porridge and root vegetables. Mead, or mead, was a completely different drink. It was a festive drink, a luxury not available to everyone. It was made from the most expensive and rare sweetener, honey, which was fermented with water. Mead was much stronger and sweeter than ale. It was valued for its taste and intoxicating effect. A barrel of mead was opened for the most important events, weddings, funerals, or the celebration of midwinter, Yule. It was a drink for gods and kings. The production of these beverages was a complex process that required precision and knowledge. A failed batch of ale could mean not just a ruined mood, but the loss of precious grain that could have been used for bread.
The finest all in the feud.
Sometimes, despite all the planning, ingenious storage methods, and strict economy, supplies ran low. Spring was late, the ice did not melt, and the barns and cellars were empty. The most terrible weeks of the year were approaching, the time of the famine gap. In these desperate moments, the Vikings turned to what was not normally considered food. It was the food of last resort, whose sole purpose was to give the body at least some energy to hold out until warmer weather arrived. It was survival in its purest form. The most famous of these dishes was bark bread, or bark bread. It was not a culinary delicacy, it was a harsh necessity. People would go into the forest and strip the inner, edible layer of bark, the cambium, from trees, most often pine or elm. This layer was soft and contained at least some nutrients. The bark was dried over a fire and then ground into flour. The resulting powder was bitter and difficult to digest, but it added volume.
Here, take this. We share what we have.
Thank you.
This flour from the bark was mixed with the last remnants of real flour. Sometimes the proportion of bark in such bread reached 80 or 90%. Such bread was heavy, resinous, and barely edible, but it filled the stomach and stifled the feeling of hunger. If even that was unavailable, dried and powdered roots, moss, and lichens were used. People used any available plant resources just to get calories. It was a struggle for every extra day of life. Even leather belts or old shoes could be used. They were boiled for a long time to obtain at least some sticky, protein-rich broth. It was the height of desperation, showing how thin the line between life and death was. Those meager weeks were the most severe test. They reminded everyone of the importance of supplies and the fragility of human life in the face of nature. Those who survived were not only strong warriors, but also prudent masters. The Viking winter diet was not a feast, but an engineering marvel. It was a complex and sophisticated system based on a deep understanding of nature. Drying in the icy wind, smoking in the smoke of the hearth, fermenting in dark barrels, and storing in the coolness of the earth were all survival techniques. What other aspects of Viking life would you like us to explore? Perhaps their medicine, shipbuilding, or the secrets of their crafts? Suggest topics for future videos you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.